All right, so Kentucky Study students, I can't join you on this Tuesday, but we will resume our in-person class on Thursday. And what we're going to look at today is the American Revolution in Kentucky, and just kind of getting some ideas about how this revolution transpired in the state and what its eventual outcomes were. All right, and then you'll have a kind of an assignment to reflect on with Blue Lick, the Battle of the Blue Licks, which is the last battle of the American Revolution that was really fought here in Kentucky, and kind of reflect on that very issue. So let's get into discussing how did this American Revolution that created the United States of America, how did that play out here in Kentucky? We've talked about the settlement of the state and how people came in here, but how did the people of Kentucky respond when America declared its independence from Great Britain and then went to war with the British Empire back in this era? First thing to highlight is some basic geography. Remember that in the American Revolution, most of the major battles are going to happen along the coast, mostly because this is where the 13 colonies were as of 1775, when some of the early fighting began to break out. Remember that Virginia and other states that we know of today, like Pennsylvania extends out farther, Virginia extends out farther, and others, these were hemmed in by the Appalachian Mountains, as well as British statements to the degree that colonists were not to venture into this area because at that time it was controlled by natives. But Virginia did deem Kentucky to basically be a county of its own. So in the American War of Independence, this is the frontier, all right? And there's going to be some minor clashes with the British, Native Americans, and settlers out here, but not to say the size of the battles that will play out elsewhere, as you see in these larger red dots on the map. So why does Kentucky matter in the American Revolution if we are the frontier? Well, we mattered to Native Americans, and we talked about the Shawnee last week when we looked at some of the visuals about Kentucky's settlement, and I also talked about the Shawnee kind of being the natives that were dominant here prior to Europeans venturing in. But the Shawnee wanted their traditional hunting grounds back. And they had to cede those grounds to Virginia in a war in 1774, just prior to the American Revolution, called Lord Dunmore's War for short. And the Shawnee wanted those hunting grounds back, but the only way that they could get them is to defeat the settlers in a larger conflict. So the American Revolution provides them an opportunity, with the help of the British forces, to drive out settlers that have started to set up farms and plantations and other types of economic enterprises in the state so that they can reclaim their domain, their control, and their hunting grounds over the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Also keep in mind that Kentucky, by being the frontier, is kind of like a buffer zone. And what I mean by that is that if the British were attacking the frontier, that kept them away from attacking some parts of Virginia. But if the British and their Native American allies took control of Kentucky, then it would allow them to use the Cumberland Gap and then attack the western features of Virginia and start creating more problems for the Virginia government. So in many ways, the frontier fighting that we see in Kentucky is used as a way to protect some of these larger states like Virginia from greater hardship during the war. And then finally, the British saw Kentucky as very important for their strategy of weakening colonial morale. The British long thought that if they could just get a lot more colonists to not support the war effort, that the war effort would fall apart. And some of their thinking on that was true, because if there weren't men or materials going to the Continental Army, then George Washington would not be able to fight the British in any major way. However, the British never quite achieved this aim, but they believed that by raiding settlements and using their native allies and attacking up and down the frontier, that it would weaken colonist support for the war, it would weaken morale, and they would beat the American independence movement into the ground. But again, that doesn't really happen, largely because of the devastating tactics when natives hit the frontier. Because after all, if somebody burns down your log cabin, they murder your wife, they murder your children, things of this sort, you're going to want revenge. You're not just going to be crying about it and then want to surrender to the British. So the defense of Kentucky went through several different phases, and in fact included Lincoln County to a degree, which we'll talk about. A lot of the defense of our region came at the behest of the guy pictured here, this red-haired guy, George Rogers Clark, who was from Virginia. But in 1776, as the American Revolution really gets underway, he petitioned the Virginia state legislature for funds to create a Kentucky militia. The argument that Clark used was that this militia would be very important in not only defending those people who had come to Kentucky to set up settlement, but it was also going to be important to keep British forces that had operated in the interior of North America from attacking Virginia and other colonies to the west. And persuaded by his actions, the Virginia militia, or the Virginia legislature, agreed to fund the creation of a Kentucky militia in 1776 under Clark's leadership. In addition to that, the defense of Kentucky largely fell to three different forts in this period. Fort Herod, which is located in Harrodsburg, Fort Logan, which is located close here to Stanford, and then Boonesboro, which is located in modern-day Richmond. There were other forts located in Kentucky as well, like Bryan Station was one of the larger forts, and it was located near Lexington. That's where Bryan Station High School gets its name. But these forts were critical to the effort against the British because they were places to house troops, they were places to shelter families, and they were also places to save supplies that could then be rerouted to the different areas of conflict. And so in a lot of the battles on the frontier, much like during the French and Indian War that had preceded this, forts were kind of like the castles of warfare in this era. And they were places for troops to station themselves, but they were also targets for enemy forces, because if you could seize forts and you could blow them up and you could set them on fire, then you ruin your enemy's supply lines, and you also ruin the degree to which they can maintain offensive military operations. And so fort battles are how the revolution will play out on the frontier in Kentucky. We'll talk about those in a moment. And then in the closing stages of the war in 1780, Virginia realizes that just having one Kentucky militia is not sustainable, that there has to be another way in which to go about doing things. And so in 1780, what they start doing is they go through and they reconfigure Kentucky into three county militias. Jefferson County, which as we know is near modern-day Louisville, Fayette County, which is where Lexington's located, and Lincoln. So Lincoln actually was deemed one of the very first Kentucky counties and one of the most important. So if you look here on a diagram, oh, and by the way, Daniel Boone, lest we forget about him, was put in charge of Lincoln County's militia. So remember, you looked at, is Daniel Boone a hero? Is he a villain? And you got to weigh in on that. Well, regardless of your opinions about Daniel Boone, his knowledge of the topography of Kentucky was deemed of very critical importance, and he was put in charge of the defense of southern Kentucky and the defense of Lincoln County at this time. So if you look at a map of the way Virginia partitioned Kentucky, this is what they were looking at. So Fayette County was basically the eastern side and the northern side, some of the central part of the state. Jefferson County was basically kind of your northwestern part of the state, as well as part of the central. And Lincoln County was here. Now, Lincoln County is a lot smaller of a county than we see today, right? But it's there. You'll also notice on this map that you'll see reserved for veterans. The reason that was there is that Virginia had already decided that after the American Revolution, those men that had fought for the Continental Army would be given free land here in Kentucky. And this is going to become the site of some major legal disputes later, whether they concern native territory or who gets this territory and various land claims. But that was Virginia's goal. And you'll notice that the Jackson Purchase of our area at this time was still controlled by the Chickasaw tribe. And it won't be until in around 1818 that Kentucky will negotiate with various native tribes, purchase this land, and make it part of the state. You'll also remember that one of our first days here talking about the promise of Kentucky and what it meant, we looked at Fort Boonesboro and kind of its configuration. Remember, these forts are kind of these ginormous things that are put together to shelter people in place and guard against various things. But they could also be defended in a variety of ways as well. In some cases, you could lift the door of a fort and you could fire in and take care of that in some cases as well. So that's something that's prevalent. All right, so let's look at some major battles here in Kentucky to kind of wrap up talking about the American Revolution here. So again, a lot of these battles aren't going to be to the same extent of battles that we see in other parts, like it's not like a Battle of Saratoga or a Battle of Yorktown, but these are still altercations that involve Kentuckians and they matter. So in the summer of 1777, one of the first major conflicts in the state and the Revolution will happen here in Lincoln County near Fort Logan, all right? Because the native forces attacked Fort Logan with the intent of forcing the settlers here in Lincoln County to pack up and leave. That was the ultimate goal, okay? But what happened in this attack is that those native forces failed to subdue Fort Logan. Because to take over a fort, you needed cannons, which natives did not have. And a lot of times natives would try to set fire to the forts, but at Fort Logan, they prevented those things from happening, and the settlers in Lincoln County were allowed to stay because they defeated the native forces. So that was an important task. The next year, in September of 1778, a native force of about 400 attacked Fort Boonesboro. And this was led by was against only 40 men that were led by Daniel Boone. But again, forts were very tough to take over, even for a very sizable force. The natives tried to set fire to Fort Boonesboro, but rain made those fires go out. Also, Daniel Boone kind of exaggerated the size of his force, and eventually the natives were persuaded to give up. But what he did was that he dressed up women like men, and then he kind of had patrols go around with the same weapons. But the native scouts thought that these were different soldiers, and so they didn't know the difference, and that kind of thwarted their attacks as well. The other thing that hurt them in attacking Boonesboro is that they would try to come up and set fire to the fort, but doing so left those native troops completely exposed to fire from riflemen that were on the parapets of the fort. So if you're on the fort, you see this native running at you, you can easily aim your gun down and shoot them, and that happened a lot. So the native force gradually dwindled over time. But one of the interesting things about that siege is that Boone had been captured months earlier by native forces, and he had escaped their capture. And so he escaped. He made a desperate march of about 180 miles of ground covered in about 5 days to get to Boonesboro and tried to lead the defense of it. But Boonesboro held out from a native attack here and did not go away. However, not all of these things were victories for Kentuckians in the war. In 1782, British and native forces tried to take over Bryan Station Fort near Lexington. Once again, they failed to do that, and they began to retreat. However, the military commander in Kentucky at the time, along with Daniel Boone, decided to pursue the retreating British and native forces, believing that they could crush them. They started to get closer to the British and the natives when Daniel Boone warned the American commander not to force the issue too much, that if they went into the forests, then what could happen is that the British and the natives could ambush them. And the commander did not listen to Daniel Boone, and basically Daniel Boone and others were ambushed and attacked from behind by the British and the native forces. And in total, somewhere around 68 or so Kentucky militiamen, including one of Daniel Boone's sons, were killed in this battle, and only 3 British/native individuals were killed on their side. So this was a British/native victory, but this so-called Battle of Blue Licks was deemed as the last battle of the American Revolution before a peace settlement was brokered between Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, our American representatives in Paris, with the British to allow for the creation of an American nation. So that's kind of how that played out. So after kind of giving you an overview of how the fighting went, what I've kind of posted in Google Classroom for you to look at is a video that will highlight the Battle of Blue Lick and what happened there in terms of it. And then after that, I just kind of have an exit slip where I want you to reflect on why do you think there were a lot of tensions here between natives and the frontiers people, because there's a lot of bloody fighting here. You know, the natives are scalping people, which means they're holding them and then kind of cutting off the top of their scalp with a knife. They're murdering women and children. The colonists are doing the same by raiding native villages. The natives will kill colonists and then they'll mutilate their bodies. I mean, it's a lot of bloody, very hard fighting. And I just want you to reflect on why do you think that was the case, which is a topic that we will revisit when we get back in class on Thursday. So I'll see you back in class at Thursday at 2:09. And what we will do on that day is we're going to look at how do you create a new state government? The revolution's been won, but what should be Kentucky's priorities in creating a new constitution? And where should we go from here? And we'll look at Isaac Shelby and why maybe he should have been the first governor of the state. And does he do a good job as the first governor of the state? We'll look at those major issues. So I'll see you back in class then, and take care.